Welcome, everyone. Today, we are taking on a pretty monumental task. We're going to compress the entire history of the world into a fast-paced, insightful journey. We'll be looking at how chaotic, perfectly interconnected events shaped literally everything around us today. I'm talking about everyday things, how the borders on our modern maps were drawn by ancient conflicts. Or, get this, how the very alphabet we use to communicate was first etched onto an ancient Canaanite lyscomb. Yes, you heard me right, a lyscomb. By diving into this explainer of human history, we can finally step back and see the big picture.
So, how exactly did we get from ancient people using lyscombs to humanity casually flying airplanes and building websites? I mean, it obviously didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't a peaceful straight line. We're going to go on a rapid chronological journey through the broad eras of history. We'll trace the baton of power as it was passed, often violently I might add, from one civilization to the next, ultimately shaping the incredibly complex, globally connected modern world we live in today.
Section 1. The First Great Civilizations. The groundwork for everything we know was actually laid between two rivers in Iraq, where the ancient Sumerians invented writing and divided our concept of time. Eventually, these independent city-states began shifting into consolidated, sprawling empires.
Sargon's approach brilliantly illustrates the mindset of those early empire builders. When asked what he proposed for the benefit of the people, Sargon, who actually built the first empire by conquering independent cities, honestly just dismissed the very idea. He flat out stated, "Kings don't rule for the benefit of the people. We rule to increase our pride, power, and possessions." That was the brutal reality of leadership back then. Meanwhile, though, across the globe, other foundational cultures were being established. You had the Egyptians building pyramids, the Minoans painting, people in the Indus River Valley building incredibly straight roads, and the Israelites forming a culture that would deeply influence the future of the world.
The chaotic cycle of rapid conquest really defined the ancient world. Sumerian city-states fell to the Assyrians, who basically conquered everywhere, only to be toppled by the Babylonians, who were then absorbed by the massive Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. But, amidst all this warfare, brilliant innovations were still spreading like wildfire. The Phoenicians, who were expert sailors and merchants, invented a phonetic alphabet. Their word for ox was Aleph and house was Bet. Put them together and boom, you get alphabet. This is that exact same brilliant system first seen on the 3,500-year-old lyscomb we mentioned earlier, a system that Greeks eagerly adopted for their own language.
Moving right along to Section 2, Prophets, Philosophers, and Beliefs. After all the endless conquering, human beings across the globe began actively seeking deeper meaning, leading to new philosophies and beliefs arising simultaneously.
It is totally fascinating to contrast these two massive intellectual booms happening at roughly the exact same time. Over in the West, right around the time the Greeks were famously fighting off the Persians at Marathon, there was this incredible intellectual explosion. Socrates is teaching Plato, who then teaches Aristotle, focusing intensely on philosophy, history, and early concepts of democracy. Over in the East, you have profound spiritual awakenings. In India, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sees suffering, becomes enlightened, and founds Buddhism to escape it. In China, Confucius is teaching people to rule well and be nice, while Lao Tzu is advising people to simply go with the flow. It was a true, massive, global awakening of human thought.
Section 3. Greeks, Romans, and Conquerors. This is the classical age of historical heavyweights, where figures like Alexander the Great conquered massive territories before leaving his generals to fiercely divide up the spoils.
Remember Aristotle from that intellectual boom? Well, he actually taught Alexander the Great, who took his revenge on the Persians and, briefly decided he was a god. When he died, his fractured Greek empire led to some truly bizarre historical moments. A Greek king in Egypt named Antiochus decided he was Zeus and demanded everyone worship him. When the Jewish people politely declined, he essentially told them, "If you don't worship me, I'll make you eat a ham sandwich." The Jews obviously told the king no thanks and rebelled, making their own nation again. But this pocket of resistance happened right as two massive new powers, the Romans in the West and the Parthians in the East, were entering the global stage to swallow everything up.
Now, while these empires were incredibly interconnected by trade and war, their lived experiences were vastly different. And, honestly, this is perfectly illustrated by everyday bathroom habits. Just think about the stark contrast. While Rome was brutally expanding, building its empire, and crucifying early Christians, which, ironically, only made Christianity more popular until the empire finally adopted it, they were wiping with sponges on sticks. The Greeks, they were using broken clay pots. Ouch!
Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the Chinese dynasties were busy inventing paper, printing, and were actually the first to invent and use actual toilet paper. It's a great reminder of the totally different paces of technological advancement across the globe.
Section 4. Middle Ages and Global Shifts. Now, this era was defined by massive population movements across Asia, the unification of India, and the explosive, unifying rise of Islam among previously fractured Arab clans.
While empires in the east and south were unifying, Europe was getting incredibly chaotic. Muslim expansion was stopped in Europe by the Franks, leading to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope eventually called for violent religious crusades to take back the Holy Land. Up north, the Vikings were sailing absolutely everywhere, stealing everything they could get their hands on, and settling in places like Russia, Normandy, and Iceland. They even set up an early real estate scam. They named a frozen landmass Greenland to attract settlers, joking that geopolitics might one day make the place hot.
But hey, if you think the Vikings or the Romans were impressive conquerors, consider the terrifying and absolutely unprecedented scale of the Mongol Empire. Alexander the Great's conquests are literally dwarfed by Genghis Khan, who stormed out of Central Asia to conquer twice as much land. Then, the subsequent Mongol Empire expansion doubled that immense territory yet again. It forcibly connected the East and the West in ways never seen before, creating the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history.
But, as you might guess, there was a very dark side to all this newly forced global interconnectedness. As the Mongols moved across the globe, they likely brought the Black Death with them. This devastating plague wiped out a staggering one-third of Europe's entire population. It was basically an apocalyptic event. Ironically, though, the sheer scale of death disrupted the old medieval systems and paved the way for a massive cultural rebirth, the Renaissance.
Moving to Section 5. Exploration and Global Revolutions. This was an era sparked by the printing press, the Spanish Inquisition, and explorers like Columbus stumbling into the Americas, leading to the devastating conquest of native empires.
As European powers literally divided the globe in half to avoid fighting over it, a dark, new global economy emerged. The Portuguese established a brutal, cyclical economic loop. They were sailing to Africa to trade goods for enslaved humans, trading those slaves in the colonies for resources and food, and returning that food to Europe for more goods to start the cycle all over again. It was an incredibly dark engine of global commerce that fueled European expansion for centuries.
All this global colonization generated massive wealth, sure, but it also generated massive debt and religious upheaval. In Europe, Martin Luther used the new printing press as a mass media tool to spark the Protestant Reformation. Meanwhile, immense colonial debt led Britain and France to heavily tax their citizens, resulting in explosive revolutions in the US, France, and across Latin America. The impact of foreign ideas was felt absolutely everywhere. In China, Christian missionary ideas influenced a man to start the Taiping Rebellion, a brutal conflict that left up to 30 million people dead. The world was practically vibrating with violent change.
Section 6. Industrialization and Imperialism. The pivot to the modern era, fueled by steam power, the rise of the massive Second British Empire, and an unprecedented global resource grab.
Deciding they wanted an industrial revolution of their own, the British used steam power to make manufacturing faster and cheaper, eventually taking over places like Australia, Canada, and India to sell their goods. While the British were grabbing the oceans, Russia was grabbing the land. After unconquering themselves from the Mongols, the Russians expanded their territory massively, pushing deep into Asia. They even claimed to have discovered Antarctica just 3 days before the British did. As a modern internet troll perfectly pointed out the absurdity of these colonial claims. Bruh, you can't discover a continent that already has penguins living there. It perfectly highlights the sheer ego of this imperial era.
That imperial ego completely culminated in what's known as the scramble for Africa. European nations like Italy, Germany, Belgium, France, and Britain all wanted pieces of the continent. They justified their invasions with twisted, newly minted Darwinian science, claiming they were the fittest to rule. Yet, this completely ignored the reality that the continent was already occupied by an overwhelming list of sophisticated, rich, pre-existing African empires: Egypt, Kush, Aksum, Mali, Songhai, Benin, and so many others. The European empires just forcefully carved up these complex civilizations for themselves anyway.
Which brings us right to the edge of the modern world, and a final provocative question. With global empires bumping right up against each other and literally nowhere left on the map to expand, what happens next? Think about it. You have massively wealthy empires, fierce competition, and powerful new technologies emerging, like telegraphs, airplanes, and submarines. The stage was perfectly, tragically set for a massive, modern collision that would reshape the world yet again. Keep that in mind as you process all the interconnected history we just uncovered today, and how it directly shaped the globally connected world we live in right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.